Welcome to Health Focus, where we focus on your health. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Anderson, and today we are very privileged to have with us author, speaker, and life coach, William Wesley, as we focus on stress reduction. Mr. Wesley, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us.
And Dr. Anderson, it's my pleasure to be with you.
And I know that you're an old friend of the Vallejo Community Access Television station, that you've done presentations here, you've clarified initiatives and been involved in many activities here. And we know each other, so I think we've agreed I'll call you William, you call me Scott.
It's a plan.
And, you know, I was really impressed reviewing your resume. You came to this field of being an author and a life coach through kind of a circuitous route. I understand your education, for example, at Golden Gate University and so forth. Tell us about it.
Right. Well, it's a long but short story. As we craft our path, and sometimes we end up exactly where we thought we'd be. Other times, because of life in different situations, we end up in other places. So as I'm going through the process, my initial thought was I was going to be this mega rich businessman, and I want to do business, and then I should get a law degree because that's going to help me do business. And life basically expanded and allowed me to be exposed to a number of things. I've been a human rights commissioner in San Francisco. I'm a Rotarian, and I do a lot of volunteering in that space. I've had children, and as I've directed those children and learned from them, it caused me to really look at, okay, what do I really want to do? And in the year I lost my mom, which was 2008, I was in the process of finishing this book, and I was in the process of graduating from law school. And what I began to look at was my life and say, you know what do I really want to do? Do I want to go into the law, or do I want to live my full potential, and that is bring forward full life balance, bring forward life coaching, and try to do something in that space.
And indeed, you've published a couple books, I believe.
Yes, I have.
And just share with us the titles of the books.
Well, the first one was called Full Life Balance, The 5 Keys to the Kingdom, and the second one is called Happiness, The 4 Factors of Happiness.
Okay. And it goes without saying that as we've struggled with the pandemic, there's been a lot of stress, physical, mental, a lot of loss, a lot of anxiety.
Absolutely.
And in researching, looking at your publications and talking to you, I understand that you have focused on really keys to achieving some level of stress reduction. This derives from which of the 2 books again?
Actually, both. The first, Full Life Balance, talked about what are some keys, and these aren't just keys I made up and they came from the universe. It was basically what I did as I began to look at my life and say, you know what? I had gotten out of balance and I was focused on a lot of the wrong things. I was chasing money and doing things like that, and I said, you know what? I need to do something to sort of pull back and look at my life. And then I began to do certain things. And then at one point I began to say, you know what? This is actually a lifestyle. And the 5 keys, one is the spiritual key, and that's basically getting your arms around who you are and stepping away from the chase periodically. For some folks it is religion. For other folks it's just meditation. For other folks it's just going to the beach. And then I said it takes energy to be successful. So that's where I really looked at the physical key: diet, water, rest, exercise, and doing something where I release endorphins and feel good. For me, I sort of play tennis and things like that. Then the emotional key. It takes not just energy and some spirituality, but we are gregarious beings. We're connected to other beings, and our interaction with these other beings can be a very great thing for us or not a great thing. And so I developed some tips around that. How do I be better as a person, as a man, as a husband, as a father? And then the last 2 quickly. One is the professional key. We need money to have shoes, clothes, cars, food, and everything else. The question is, what do we do to achieve that money? Do we do something that fulfills our purpose, or do we just do that thing because that's the thing that gives us money? Either way, we're making some choices with our feet, our activity, and if we're going to do that thing, then we might as well accept it and be the best at that thing. And then the last is charitable. I think a lot of us have been blessed and given certain things, and I consider it part of my obligation to give some of that back.
So you're talking about a balance in all of these areas.
Absolutely.
And maybe you could share with us some of the ways that we could put these keys into actual usage. For example, the first key, that would be the spiritual. What tools would one employ to pursue that?
Got it. And especially now, I mean, this is a very stressful time. We see it with folks on planes just getting outside of themselves. Really a good person, but now so upset because of stress and everything else, and they're acting out on a plane. You see it in increased road rage and all of that. So Spiritual Key says, periodically step away from everything. One of the big tips, I call it 5 minutes of peace. Every morning, I try to just sit down for 5 minutes and just think about my breathing. It's meditation, but just think about my breathing. All I'm focusing on is my breathing, and I'm releasing everything else. And many of us, since we're so involved in social media and television and all of this other entertainment, that we rarely step away like Americans did 100 years ago, where there wasn't television and you could just sit down and be at peace. And there's something about being at peace, something about just being quiet and hearing yourself speak to yourself. And it helps reset, it helps reboot, it helps sort of restart you. So, and by the way, when you first try this, you may not make it to 5 minutes, but that's okay, you can do it. So the idea would be, I'm gonna be quiet for 5 minutes. If you make it to 1.5 minutes, congratulations. Tomorrow, go for 2.5 minutes.
I think in trying to do that, you must at times feel like you're swimming upstream, because with technology, for example, cell phones, communications via email, etc., stepping away is very difficult. For example, cell phones sort of scream out for attention. When you get a text, they make sounds, you feel a desire to look down. Some people have even observed that you might get a rush of endorphins in the brain every time you check your email. So how do you turn off all these distractions?
You turn them off. Just for a period of time. Now, yes, you work, you have a life, you have family and all of that. But even when I do my scheduling in terms of my day, I will look at emails early in the morning, and I'll look at emails midday, and I may look again late day, unless there's some emergency. So I'm not constantly be drawn to the email. Well, the same thing in terms of you and meditation. You are more important than your phone. You're more important than anything connected to that phone. So for 5 minutes in the morning, could you turn that off? I'm not saying have it on low buzz, right? That's still triggered. It has to be off,
right?
Where you can spend 5 minutes just giving yourself some time to reflect. So that's one key. The physical key talks to not just diet, water, rest, exercise. It talks to the release of endorphins. It talks to the release of things we need to release periodically that just make us feel good. For some, it's walking and running and all of that. Go ahead.
Well, if I didn't mean to interrupt,
Absolutely.
but I believe you've focused, for example, on breathing under the physical. So breathing, is that more or less in a meditative manner, or is that through exercise, or what kind of breathing?
Well, in the spiritual key, it's more of meditation. In the physical key, it is more of, I want to do some activity that causes my cardio to reach a certain level. Now, of course, check with your doctor. Can you play basketball, or can you jog or swim? Whatever it determined that you can do. For me, I do a fast walk every day. And I tend to walk roughly 10,000 steps a day. So every day, I'm getting that 30 or 40 minutes in of where my cardio is speeding up. And sometimes I'll do a slight walk, jog. But the point is, not just breathing, but I need increased breathing every day to release a lot of stress and to release endorphins to basically feel good.
Right, and in fact, physiologically, exercising is a kind of stress inoculation.
Absolutely.
Because by subjecting our body to a little bit of cardiovascular stress, we, for example, elevate stress hormones like epinephrine and cortisol, and then our body becomes more resistant to the deleterious effects of those hormones.
That's a great point, because if we have constant stress, which is the next step, that constant stress, which a lot of folks are apparently under, releases the sustained amount of cortisol, and that can be detrimental to your health. So good cortisol is a release from a physical activity, as I understand it. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a person with a body who does a lot of reading about it. But bad is where it's sustained.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. And also, we were talking a little bit off camera, and there may be sort of a curve for stress where the complete absence of stress is unhealthy. For example, astronauts in space who have no stress, they lose muscle mass and bone mass. But grinding ongoing stress 24 hours a day, as you might find with collapse of society and being incarcerated in a rough environment or whatever, that's not healthy.
Absolutely.
And so we're trying to get that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
And the timing also, when you experience it, and maintaining control over it.
Yeah, and being aware that you are experiencing it. So, some folks react to it by it being stress, by shopping, some folks buy alcohol, some sex, right? Where they're using these other things, and those are temporary fixes because you can't shop forever, and you can't have sex forever, and you can't drink forever, right? So at some point, it will become worse as opposed to better.
Okay, so William, we talked about the first key, which is spiritual. The second key, physical, and we mentioned for spiritual the breathing and centering, and for physical getting the breath rate up, exercising, aerobic. Could you enlighten us about the third key? That would be emotional.
Sure. The third key is emotion. So I'm married. I have a wonderful wife, and we have a great relationship. And what we found is one of the best things that keeps a relationship great is a couple of romantic dinners. And she goes out on Thursday, I go out on Friday. But what we found, though, we want to communicate, right? And I, as a man, and this is not sexist, my communication is different from my wife's communication. When I talk about things, I tend to talk in a different path, and she gives you more color and context. Neither one is good or bad, but they're different. So, and do not get me wrong. I'm not saying I've mastered this. I'm in the process of trying to be a better William than I was before. And one of the things I do, I try to reflect, one, in the moment in terms of how she's reacting to me, but equally important, at the end of the day, I try to spend 5 minutes reflecting. And not just in reference to my wife, but how was I today? Was I a good man? That's my goal, right? So if I had interactions with folks that they respond to what I was saying, was I so busy thinking about what I was going to say while they were talking that I didn't even pay attention to what they were doing? And sometimes you can't see it in the moment. But if you get used to the 5 minutes apiece in the morning, it will increase your tool, your ability to go back and reflect. And sometimes it may require you to call someone and say, you know what, I'm sorry. Yesterday when we talked, you know, it seems like I really didn't pay attention to what you said. And I apologize for that. And that actually builds better relationships and everything else.
That's very intriguing. What I hear you saying really is that we're talking about a voyage, a pathway, which is a theme that also shows up in some spiritual and religious traditions, that we're constantly slowly progressing down a pathway.
Sure does, sure does. And that's the key. I think we do a disservice to ourselves when we feel we're complete.
I agree with you. Let's go to the fourth key, professional. Building up knowledge and skills, I think, is more or less how it's summarized in your book.
Absolutely.
Tell us more about that.
So you've heard people say, okay, if you find the thing you enjoy, you can do that forever, and it doesn't even feel like you're at work. Well, for most folks, that just doesn't work, right? You may be a toll taker on the bridge. Yeah, it's the money you make. But did you dream about doing this? Is this the fulfillment of your goal? Probably not. But for some of us, at some times in our lives, we have to do certain things to get the money we need. So maybe I work this job because this job provides the income, and if I really think I'm Michelangelo or some painter, then on the weekends maybe I'm painting or teaching kids how to paint. So I think you can do both. And I believe you should increase your ability in whatever the thing is you decide to do. So get the additional certification, get the additional learning, have a mentor, someone further down the path that you say you want to craft, and learn something brand new every day about it. We are blessed in this point in time to have the internet, and it's endless. So I can learn anything about anything at virtually any time. So for me, it's a minimum of an hour a day of either reading or learning or something. I listen to speakers and see how they speak. I read different authors to understand what they're reading, but I also read about my craft, and I read about other things I'm interested in. So it's roughly an hour a day I try to spend learning something I didn't know the day before.
Could it be something more avocational, like pursuing an interest in music?
Absolutely.
You know, I'm thinking that in terms of building up skills, sometimes skills evolve too. You know, for example, I'm thinking of Miles Davis, who when he first recorded the best-selling jazz album of all time, Kind of Blue, in 1959, he had what he called modal jazz. But subsequently, he turned to being more influenced by other sources like rock and roll. And there's a similar artistic journey for other artists. And you mentioned painters. I think Michelangelo is one, but one who practiced for a long time would be, for example, Picasso, went through his blue period.
Exactly.
So even though we
may
not be at that level, but should we aspire to also grow and change?
Absolutely. And you mentioned Miles. He is absolutely my favorite composer and musician of all time. And you look at his path, so you go through the birth of the cool in the 40s, which sort of created that whole West Coast jazz thing, but it didn't really come on yet. Then you go through the different quintets he had, and then 1959 kind of blew. But then you go 10 years later, and he basically creates jazz fusion.
Right.
Right, which a lot of folks play now. So there were some transitions, and Miles, like every human who is aware of it, was constantly looking for the next thing. So we as humans can say, you know what, I enjoy doing this and this is fine, but what is the next thing? And I mentioned toll takers. If I was a toll taker on the Golden Gate Bridge and there were folks who were making great incomes, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, including overtime, but you have to look forward and say, will I be able to do this for the next 5, 10, or 15 years? And the first red flag was the fast track.
Right.
That was the flare that said, you know what, this is changing. So some folks began to take additional courses. Other folks didn't. So when the bridges finally stopped, and not just now in terms of the pandemic,
Right.
but the Golden Gate was the first,
Right.
a lot of those folks were left out on the cold, where others had additional certifications or degrees or whatever to move forward.
So build up those professional skills and constantly try to hone them and develop them and see if you can be adaptable to changes. And
Absolutely.
let's move to the fifth key, the charitable activities. I believe you've been recognized by the Rotarians as being, was it Rotarian of the Year in
Yeah, a few years
2017?
back. Yeah.
So
yeah.
this is something where you've given a lot to the community. And what I hear you saying is when you give to others, you get a lot back.
Yeah, yeah. I actually did a speech called Be Selfish, Do Good. Right? When you actually do good, you're releasing endorphins and you actually feel good about it. In fact, I submit you may be feeling better than the person you're helping. Right? So if you're ever so wrapped up in your story, your stuff, your bills, your situation, go to the free food clinic, get on string beans and dole out string beans to a person who the biggest task is, one, will I eat again soon? Right. Or two, will I be safe that night? Get in your car, drive to your house with your refrigerator and all of that. To me, if you're aware, that gives you perspective. That says, you know what, whatever I was thinking about is not as bad as the person I just helped eat.
Yeah, I think in fact psychologists have said that helping others gives a sense of happiness and peace that has been, shown not just philosophically and in a spiritual sense, but it's been shown to be good for mental health.
Absolutely, mental and physical health, but
Yeah.
because there's so many good things happening when your body is releasing the good hormones.
And the converse side of that is that when people retire or cease to be involved in the community, they often have a feeling of maybe not feeling as useful and as relevant, and that can lead to depression.
Absolutely.
And of course, being useful doesn't necessarily mean just going out and earning a buck, but it could also mean contributing as a volunteer.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that you're reminding us of that. That's a key thing. And if you want to volunteer, let's face it, if you're struggling to survive, it becomes more difficult.
Yes.
So we're focusing on the show on health issues primarily, but there's no escaping the fact that you need to have some sense of control over your financial destiny to pursue these sort of altruistic acts. And I believe you've had an interest in that in your writings as well. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So I've spent years as not just a life coach and an author and a speaker, but also a financial coach. I literally cut my teeth in the financial service industry. So I've been a bank branch manager, a regional investor education manager, and an investment advisor for firms like Schwab, Merrill Lynch, and Citibank. And what I've learned, especially as a result of the Price Waterhouse Coopers survey in 2019, they said 59% of all stress is financial stress. It's the biggest stressor combined of all the other stresses, relationships, vocation, health. It's the biggest stressor for folks who are under stress. So we can say, be charitable and help folks out, but you have to lay that foundation. And my grandmother said the single biggest thing you can do in terms of understanding money is understand that it's not what you make, it's actually what you spend. So if you can craft a plan that says I can live within what I make and set money aside, then you increase the odds of feeling okay about yourself. A lot of us unfortunately make $43,000 and spend $50,000, and we do that by swiping it on a credit card, and we have to pay that at some point. And then it balloons and balloons, and then we're up against the creek. So one of the things I talk about in financial coaching is making sure you craft a spending plan. Make sure you pay yourself first. We were told to pay your bills and when you get paid, but the first thing to do is pay yourself. You bring in $5,000, you pull $500 off the top, and that goes into your emergency fund, and then you craft your budget around the 45. So that means maybe some suspension or some reduction or whatever, but it simply means really that you're spending more than you should be able to spend based on your income. So we're going to have to modify the income to get inside of what we actually spend.
Right, that makes sense. Do you ever have the feeling that much of what you're involved with, William, are issues that humanity has wrestled with for millennia? That, you know, as time goes on, we're all struggling to achieve this balance. But perhaps society is changing over time and it's becoming more challenging in different ways. So is some of this the change in the overall culture and society, as well as just the perennial challenge for human beings to balance your financial self-interest with, you know, your well-being and what you give to others?
I think so. I think as you look at it, I'm a big student of history, so I do a lot of reading about different periods, especially financially. But I saw a movie recently, and I know we shouldn't advertise movies, but it's called Soul. It's an animated movie, and it talks about the existential question: why are we here?
Right.
Right. And it's a great look at why we're here from almost a comic view. But if we assume we're here for some purpose, and if we assume our finances have us so wrapped up that we can't even live our purpose, then one of the first things we have to do is sort of get that financial piece together. That tends to open the door, and now we can begin to look at all the other things we need to do. Right. But it's always been the question, man's big task, one is survival. The next big task, once you look at the different levels of the Maslow's needs hierarchy, right? So once I get my sustenance out, and then I begin to deliver my purpose. Well, you can't get to that if you're starving.
You know, it's very interesting because I think that the concept of the so-called hierarchy of needs of Maslow, I think some have criticized it. And one thing that I wonder about is that if we started to have this problem after the onset of the Industrial Revolution, because, for example, anthropologists have studied hunter-gatherers who have very little in the way of material possessions, but they seem to have a lot of time for storytelling, family, resting, and interactions. And I wonder if, to the extent that we have a lack of money and financial well-being, if part of the problem is that we demand too much. For example, I was also looking at some ancient Greek philosophers, and I think Euripides said something about how if you live in poverty but you have inner peace, I forget exactly what he said, but you're kind of wealthy.
Exactly.
On the other hand, in those days, they didn't struggle with the need to get health insurance. Society wasn't as complicated, and the material well-being of a person was defined in simpler terms, whether it was before when we were hunter-gatherers or after, up to the Industrial Revolution. So these are really complicated things to sort out, not just practically, but culturally and historically, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, I struggle with all this myself as I think about it.
And I think we all do, especially those of us connected to it. But there are still places on the planet where folks aren't connected to it. And you'll find more longevity, you find better health, you find better mental health. So even though they're living in this time, they're not living in this environment. So it's clear to me that part of it is environmental. And like the studies, when they look at social media and the effect on young girls, right? That whole self-image thing and all of that. Well, young girls in general don't have this huge problem with self-image. It's young girls who are in social media and they're constantly looking at social media to evaluate their self-worth that causes a problem. So we can go to Papua New Guinea and they're not having that problem as a 13-year-old girl. So it's not just the time we live in, it's the environment we live in and how a lot of us are susceptible to all of that.
Yeah, and I must say that I find it hard to romanticize too much living in a completely rugged hunter-gatherer environment because there are downsides to that. The longevity tends to be about 40. People die of predation and other problems.
And there's no vaccinations.
Right, all that
no
stuff.
No polio vaccine,
Yeah, I tend to think that, when you get a financial well-being to a level where you have your elemental needs taken care of and your need for recreation, medical care, education, that there's a certain point where beyond that, money could even become a bit of a distraction from your other activities if you are too obsessed with it. But on the other hand, everything, including educating your children and getting medical care, seems to work better when you do have financial resources. So these are difficult balances. Our time is running low, and I wonder, you've enlightened us with really some incredible ideas of tools for diminishing stress and improving our well-being. Do you have any sort of take-home message for our audience about how people can make sort of baby steps to start this process?
Sure. 5 minutes of peace is critical. Doing something physically to release endorphins, equally critical. Dealing with your relationships and interactions, right? Sometimes you are wrong, sometimes you're right. That happens. The question is, do you apologize and try to mend the relationships as a result of it? And part of that is to reflect on your interactions. Professionally, a lot of folks go to work and they'll say things like, oh, it's Monday. Well, yeah, it's Monday, and if you're lucky, you'll make it to Tuesday. That's a good thing. You're alive on Monday to work, as opposed to sending the immediate negative energy and then other folks co-sign the negative energy, as opposed to, how are you? I'm thriving because I'm up and I'm doing certain things. So those are some of the tips. The other tips we talk about in the second book, and that is the 4 factors of happiness. And one of the big factors of happiness is the ability to laugh and all the releases that happen with laugh. So for me, I like to try to tell a joke, or I love to hear jokes. I listen to comedy routines. I want to hear things funny. That laughing, it's hard to stay stressed when you laugh. It's hard to move, down that negative path when something is funny to you. So there are a lot of tips inside of there.
So to summarize, we've talked about your 2 books, Full Life Balance, The 5 Keys to the Kingdom, and the 4 factors of happiness, open in case of emergency. But I think we've also learned, William, that a lot of these themes seem to repeat themselves and come through again and again, of really working to maintain your own health and helping those around you by doing that, and trying to maintain moderate levels, appropriate levels of stress, perhaps lower levels of stress along the way, through spiritual and physical tools.
Exactly.
I've learned so much by talking to you. I just want to really extend my thanks for joining us here on Health Focus, and I'll give you the fist bump because of the circumstances, but it's just been an honor. I hope you'll come back and visit us again.
It would be my pleasure, Scott. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And it's been a pleasure being with you, our audience, as we've explored how to diminish stress in these difficult times. Remember, here at Health Focus, we focus on your health, and we hope you will join us again soon. Bye now.